I want to welcome everyone here today to a video feature for the Legacy of John Williams website. Since I am a very huge admirer of some of our fellow podcasters around the web, on the World Wide Web, I thought that it could be a great idea to have here a couple of people who I admire a lot, who are doing great work in terms of film music education and film music literature through our podcasts. So I have here with me today the Brueggemann brothers. William Brueggemann, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. This is an absolute pleasure. I know I speak for both my brother and I when I say the feeling of respect is absolutely mutual. The Legacy of John Williams is just a delightful podcast and resource for any of us fans of just that, the legacy of the incredible and immortal John Williams.
Hear, hear.
And also Marty Brueggemann, thank you for being here today.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting us. And what a treat that we can have a pair of brothers here to talk about this great music.
Yes, and also I have here beside me my brother, Gianmaria, who is probably known mostly on the Legacy of John Williams website as the author of the beautiful illustration that is on the top of the logo for our website.
An illustration that has been viewed by the man himself, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I actually presented to Maestro John Williams himself the illustration in Vienna when me and Gianmaria went to attend his beautiful concerts with the Vienna Philharmonic at the Musikverein in Vienna. And so I had the immense privilege to be greeted by Maestro John Williams at the end of the Sunday concert. And so as a gift to him, I presented him Gianmaria's drawing, and he was very, very happy to receive it. And he was very amused, actually, because he kind of recognized his daily routine of writing lots of music with scattered pieces of papers on his piano bench. And he had a very nice and lovely laugh when he saw that beautiful illustration that actually became a kind of a trademark for the Legacy of John Williams website.
It was really a great privilege to contribute to the website, because I think your contribution is really priceless in terms of documenting this very specific but also very, very important piece of music history. And of course, the fact that John Williams now has a copy of this drawing, wherever he hang it somewhere, or just keep it somewhere in a drawer, is just a thrill, thinking that he has just a little piece of me, but actually of both of us with him. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to have a couple of brothers. I felt some kind of kinship, if I may say so, while listening to your podcasts, because I recognized this kind of experience of growing up. I think that we're roughly about the same generation, and people we grew up in the 80s, probably on a steady diet of the same kind of popular culture. And there is also something very special when you can share this kind of passion with a family member, because you can sometimes really get into the fine details about music or movie making. Even though music is not my profession, it's really a great treat to have somebody within the family to talk about it.
Right.
I think.
Yeah, I find that that's pretty common with love for film music in particular, that your sibling might be your first compatriot. There's something about being able to share that level of detail and depth for these scores that we love, and really these often very small slices of the scores that we love. Especially when growing up, I would usually find it difficult to bring that sort of thing up in a conversation on the playground or something. And you can't say enough about that.
And that's just
very
because
special
everyone on
bond
the playground
among
was more of a Danny Elfman fan. So the John Williams
yeah,
discussion.
unequivocally. No.
Well, it really warms my heart when I see now my son trying to share his love of John Williams. And of course, John Williams offered this particular very unique hook, because maybe he has friends who are not very familiar with music or film music, but of course they know Star Wars or Harry Potter. They're huge fans of that. And so, of course, you can use kind of that to evangelize about the Maestro.
Yeah, it's a great on-ramp for that. I'm reminded of something that I think Desplat mentioned in an interview years ago, where he talked about connecting with the Star Wars score for some of its more extreme or advanced orchestral techniques, as we might say, likening them to elements of Stravinsky or whatever. And he mentioned in this interview, he was so surprised that his friends latched onto those moments just as well as the more diatonic, tuneful moments, but yet they couldn't give Stravinsky the time of day. And I think there is something about this music that's attached to this medium that's just so ubiquitous and popular and so well known and accepted, in so many folks that, it's just a great opportunity for beginning to talk about more advanced orchestral music and kind of symphonic architecture and all the rest of it.
I think that's true. I also think John Williams, in particular, he's this amazing middle point between all of these wonderful traits that we admire in various composers. First of all, his melodic gift has been well celebrated and well documented. His orchestrational talents, his versatility, I think one of his greatest gifts and one of his greatest virtues is how well literate he is in the language of cinema and the language of film music. And I think he always, without fail, understands the best tool for the job, which is, I think, why his music is so potent and why it sticks with us. And I think that's the reason why people that have seen Star Wars can listen to that desert music on Tatooine. Yet if you play them, some Stravinsky, maybe it's not the same thing because they don't make the same emotional associations. But it isn't just an arbitrary thing. I don't think you could swap out classical music for Williams music and have the same effect. I really think he really is this great center point because it's that mixture of the great harmonic and symphonic daring that he boasts, but also mixed with this, you always feel like you're in good hands. And even amongst something incredibly diatonic and restrained and stately and measured, there's always a little bit of darkness. Like he's always pulling you forward, and that's why I think it's a great
some little
comparison.
Flourish or some little surprise. And
that you talk about kind of evangelizing people into the world of classical music. I think that's something that John Williams music in and of itself does, because there's something another composer might choose to do something that is only, say, diatonic, where John Williams might have a very diatonic theme that's supported by really sort of chromatic or surprising harmony. Or you can take a melody like the Harry Potter theme, for instance, where in and of itself is quite chromatic and suggests harmony that even amongst film music
that he doesn't even really express always.
And it would be the kind of harmony that maybe in film music you'd associate with a more tense cue, something almost horrific and terrifying, yet he's able to present it in this balletic, beautiful, heroic, powerful theme.
Yeah, I think the theme itself, the Hedwig's theme, is kind of it's very kind of a question mark kind of theme, because it evolves and it develops in a way that it feels very uncertain in a way, melodically. But he gives this beautiful environment and textural environment where you feel very much at home in many ways, in the sense that he evokes these feelings of magic and wizardry, and we make these association purely by our, the cultural association that we make is based on the shared mythological past that we his music is very much always trying to get into, and this is something I recently thought about, because I was talking with a friend just today actually on Facebook, and he was talking about the March of the Villains from Superman, which is a beautiful kind of steady march, which,
as legend has it, that may have been the initial Jawa theme.
Yeah, exactly. And also John Williams wrote several pieces in that kind of Prokofiev like fashion.
Yeah.
But that piece, I remember very well that Superman was one of the very first soundtrack albums that me and Gianmaria got when we were just 9-10 years old, more or less. And I very distinctly remember that when we put on the record for the very first listening session that we did together, that piece, of course, it was associated with the movie because it was the villain's march, but the way the piece is constructed and the way it develops, of course, it's a kind of a concert arrangement, and it doesn't appear in that fashion anywhere in the movie.
Right.
So what happened there was that I started to make pictures in my head, figuring out my own story, my own movie, in a way. And it wasn't associated with Superman or Lex Luthor or anything like that, but I was starting to think about maybe in very general, broad terms about, a march of toy soldiers marching on and getting bigger and bigger and bigger and trying to walk into a cliff and then falling down the cliff,
Yeah.
And growing up, I really realized that was an incredible power, the incredible evocative power of that music. John Williams' music is able to make you feeling very distinct images in your head,
Right.
even
absolutely.
maybe not associated with the movie or with the story that is attached to, but maybe
Right.
with the broader terms.
Well, I definitely, I think in a different era, he would have been like a Berlioz or a Respighi or even a Tchaikovsky, sort of a neo-romantic composer that would be able to, because his music does tell a story. And the thing that I so adore about his music is he uses some of the harmonic innovations of the 20th century as just other tools in his belt, because you can listen to so many of the wonderful Russian composers and people that create tone poems or ballet composers, and as sophisticated and rich and as evocative as they can get, there's almost no composer that is able to draw from the full spectrum of the palette. Because like with Tchaikovsky, for instance, you get the beautiful, stirring, emotional, gorgeous, romantic melodies. And maybe with Stravinsky, you get the really raucous and interesting, dissonant, surprising orchestral sounds. But there's never one composer who's able to combine all of that. I mean, I think there were
Williams
some
can
people
almost be like the best sort of retrospective of that music that we love, yet it is so originally inspired. And again, as you just mentioned a minute ago, there's just such a strong melodic voice.
There are, in fact, if backtracking a bit, because I was thinking that it's almost kind of getting spoiled growing up listening to a lot of John Williams, because his music is very specific also, not only in terms of the emotion of the images that it can evoke, but also in the terms of the structure and the harmony. I must also thank the both of you, because through your podcast I was able to finally understand how much the harmonization is actually kind of the really the great mark of John Williams's particular voice, I think. I mean, probably you can say that of many composers, that the harmonization is really a trademark of a particular composer. But I understand, okay, so I like him because John Williams harmonizes, with these extended harmonies like that, but also because he trains your ear to a very sophisticated kind of music. And I was like, my 9-year-old is practicing the Hedwig's theme in a kind of a simple piano reduction. And sometimes he plays and maybe he hits a note not completely wrong, and I say, and to me it's fine, but they say, no, it's not, I have to flatten that, I have to sharpen that. And so it's really fine-tuning his ear a lot, thanks to John Williams. So I think to my younger son is 6, is playing the hell out of a Star Wars game somewhere, and he has the TIE Fighter attack music, and he cannot stop singing, the rhythm, dum 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 dum. And it's funny
Yeah.
because it's not that intuitive, but John Williams
Right.
is able to write such a syncopated rhythm that stucks into your head and educates you to count, and so it's really like growing up with a steady diet of really refined cuisine and not even knowing that, thinking that no, that's normal. And so when for instance, I remember very well when I was a teenager, a lot of people, a lot of my peers were listening to a lot of rock and stuff like that, and I couldn't find that kind of richness until I, for instance, discovered progressive rock, and I said, okay,
sure.
that's more my thing. And so Genesis or Jethro Tull, okay,
Right.
there is inventiveness, there is a lot more color, a lot, fancier instrumentation and development, and I think it's great. But it's funny because if you grow up listening to John Williams, you think it's commonplace. You think, oh,
Right.
that's what
Right.
music is, and essentially to find somebody who is that sophisticated and refined, it's not that easy. And also, it's almost like he cannot help himself. He was thinking, like he write maybe a very direct diatonic melody, but then he sustain it with a lot of harmony that's a lot more interesting. I think also when other composers maybe in the past took Williams' themes because they were doing another installment of one of his franchises, and maybe reharmonized his themes, and
we won't
suddenly,
name any names.
No, I mean,
it's never.
We can think of a couple of
it
examples.
Never feels right. And I mean, I definitely remember in particular in the first Potter film that he wasn't involved in. When you hear, I won't say the name of the composer, but you hear
Who's a wonderful composer.
Goblet of Fire, when it first gets not just reharmonized, but also
the melody,
some of those chromatic notes that you were talking about. This needs to be flattened, where it's like it's just a little bit off. And I think one of the great thing about John Williams, I mean, because it isn't because it's been said before that, he can present these beautiful diatonic themes with rich, complicated harmony, which is definitely true. But then the opposite is true, where he can take complicated harmony and make it sound as though it's diatonic. For instance, Vader's theme. I don't think ever before in film music history has music that's built of really non-tonal, minor third relations been so singable, been so emblematic of a character. I mean, you can say that Williams' harmonic language is influenced by an earlier generation of film composers like Miklos Rozsa or Bernard Herrmann or people like that, which I think is true, yet I don't think any of them use that specific harmonic language to write as melodically and as memorably as he does.
Even when Williams is employing these more advanced gestures, there's always just so much appeal in them. I mean, I think the TIE Fighter battle from the original film is such a great example. That sort of mixed meter on the page. I imagine reading it and it maybe being a little jarring or confusing or arbitrary. When you hear what he's doing, often melodically or rhythmically through these kind of surprising moments, it's just so infectious. And I agree with what we're saying about how that can be spoiling when you encounter it at a young age. I think on the one hand, composers like Williams, the great film composers, can sort of open a door to the classical repertoire. Sometimes, though, you may find yourself, you may be left wanting going back to some of that original material if you're kind of exposed to that Williams almost pop music appeal rendering of some of those textures and rhythms and that sort of a thing. So
well, of course, one thing that one has to do is to expand the horizon. For instance, I remember Maurizio and I grew up with Williams, and of course, because of the cinema of the 80s, then you meet Alan Silvestri, Jerry Goldsmith, Bruce Broughton. We can name, I think, a slew of composers who wrote wonderful scores, and especially in the landscape. If you compare that with the landscape of today, maybe you think, oh, we were really lucky back then.
Yeah, I'd love also just to add one note to what Gianmaria is saying. Was also about, I think, the richness of most of the TV music that we were exposed to, especially from some of the US TV series that we were watching.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because I very recently kind of rediscovered some of those stuff, like the Incredible Hulk.
Oh, wow,
even the A-Team or Dallas
Sure.
or Dynasty or that stuff. Maybe we weren't fans of Dallas or Dynasty, but it was music that was kind of in our ears because
And orchestral scores week to week.
yes.
which is
So
such a treat.
and that was kind of advanced or maybe not too complex kind of language for TV because it was very direct, but it was a lot richer than probably nowadays is. So that was very important. Our ears were already very kind of receptive to what was something very interesting in terms of maybe harmonic language or melodic contour and things like that. And maybe it was very unconscious in many ways.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's such an excellent point. I think television music, television underscore is sort of a gateway drug for a lot of extended musical vocabulary, especially, let's say, you go back to Carl Stalling's great music
Of course,
with Looney
yes.
Tunes and the Merry
But I
Melodies.
do remember specifically a short-lived TV show which is called Scarecrow and Mrs. King. And I do remember it was a very short-lived TV show, and in Italy it was never big. But I do remember that the theme music, the title song, the title tune, was absolutely catchy, and it was by Arthur Rubinstein. It was not the pianist, the
Right.
TV the composer Arthur B. Rubinstein.
Right.
And I remember when I was listening to that as a young kid, I was kind of convinced it was John Williams, because it was written in that fashion of very catchy in the harmonies and very very engaging in the rhythms that he used, and it was and I think that in those years it was very common to have maybe even a minor TV show with a very carefully constructed score, even just the title music by a fully respected composer.
People talk a lot about Star Wars, I think, as being such a huge influence, but I think it's a little bit more of like the 1, 2, 3 punch of Jaws, Star Wars, and then Superman
Yeah.
the year after that I think, first of all, cast a huge shadow on the landscape of film music and film composers, but I think also gave so much freedom to composers to say, this is the kind of richness that not only can you deal with, but this is what now film goers are going to expect from their
Also,
cinema
this is what
music.
a blockbuster will sound like.
Yeah.
As that's being defined right in that same time period.
Yeah.
And I have a question for you, Will and Marty. Actually, what do you think is essential or that makes John Williams' music so catchy for kids? Actually, because we are so far we are talked about our experiences as young kids growing up listening to John Williams' music and being very excited. So at least in part we have already answered that. But if you have to boil down to one or two key elements of what renders John Williams' music so catchy for kids, what do you think that will be?
That's such a great question. I think it has to do with how we often view children, honestly, in our kind of global society. And at least here in America, I think there's been sort of a growing tendency to sort of, on the one hand, maybe infantilize children. And on the other hand, it can sometimes feel like children are exposed to things earlier than we're sort of prepared for. So it can sometimes feel like there's this gulf between material that is maybe overly catered to you and all of the edges have been sanded down. And then there's material that's kind of urging you on to teenagehood or something. And I think John Williams' music at least I can speak for myself, it really spoke to me as a child because it had all of the appeal, the wonder, the strong clarity of a great melodic line, let's say, but it didn't shy away from danger, from mystery, from the confusing, from the misunderstood, and
or even sexuality and romance.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think Hedwig's theme is a great example. My studio partner's kids just the other day, and I was sitting by the piano. What do you want to hear? Harry Potter theme. And there's something, we've already spoken about the chromatic complexity in that melody and in the underlying harmony. That's not too advanced for kids. That is the childhood experience. And I think it's actually misunderstood more often than not. And in the hands of a great artist like John Williams, it's this immediate connection. And for those of us that can put a name to the art, and looked at the LP cover and, until we like bore holes in it with our eyes, it's a lifelong relationship.
I also think that if I were to maybe be analytical it's hard to dissolve things that are so rich and full of complexity into simple rules or tropes, because I don't think John Williams' music is made simply. I don't think he has some sort of basic formula that he can depend on. I imagine it's just the result of a lot of experience, wisdom, and hard work. But I do think the element to which he crafts his melodies and how brutal it sounds that he is to himself when trying to find a set of pitches that are iconic, I do think that is a big part of it. And I mean, I think even if you look at some of my favorite of his melodies would be like in Home Alone, ya, na, 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 na. Like I get the sense that he probably slaved away over just those pitches, because I think it's like the level of structure and form, and I mean, he's clearly so literate with music. I think the means of developing a theme is probably almost second nature to him. I think what he spends a lot of time on is finding those 4 or 5 notes that immediately work as almost a motivic trigger, because it has to in the film. It has to work as like a leitmotif. You need to hear, bum, 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 and know, oh, okay, that's this character's theme. And I think it's his ability to write so concisely, yet have so much personality in it's really, I think, about compression and condensing ideas. The fact that almost all of his best and most memorable themes you can express and communicate in 3 or 4 notes, and they are distinct. They're not, you can't just replace one for another. They don't all sound the same.
Well, personality, I think, is such a great word there, Will. It's not only that a melody might have great economy of note or rhythm, but there's usually some appealing turn or intervallic jump or something that allows it to really stand out in your mind, because and this goes to how motifs have to work in a film. It's not only that it has to be appealing and hopefully make you feel something, but it has to be recognizable. And honestly, I think that's an art that really wasn't fully developed until the advent of the film score. I think it just so happens that there are recognizable motifs in great ballet and opera music, but I don't think the necessity was there in quite the same way as it is in the medium we're talking about, where the music has to battle against so many other sonic forces and so many other elements that are vying for your attention.
Well, that's an interesting thing. It's like oftentimes when a classical analysis, or even when I hear people discuss Wagner, and discuss his use of leitmotif in opera, so often they'll be like, oh, listen to this motif, and it's like, yeah, na, na, na. It's just like some chromatic thing, and it's like, okay, that can be a motif, but a John Williams motif is like it's like a ringtone. A John Williams motif is yum bum 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 bum. It's not mistakable. You can't just
if it were a
run
drawing,
to the piano and play
the
it in 2
silhouette
seconds.
of the character would be recognizable.
But we can also point to some of the cue specific material he very often writes, and sometimes it's just even maybe a rhythm pattern that he uses, like we were talking about the TIE fighter attack rhythm motif, or I was thinking about also.
Well, I think of the March of the Villains of Superman, for instance. I think it's the rhythms in that melody are more interesting than the actual pitches. If you were to just play the pitches at even distance rhythmically, I think it would be really quirky. It would be just da 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 da. Yeah, I cannot even sing it.
No, that's a great point.
But I think that the March of the Villains is the dum dum da dum. It's the difference.
It's very pointed, very accented. Yeah.
But then in that case, I think also the arrangement and the specific choice of timbre is also important there too. I was thinking about Jabba's theme actually from Return of the Jedi, which that kind of like minory theme on the tuba with the sort of glissandi that's like he only would have written a theme like that for the tuba. So it isn't just about the pitches, but the pitches are informed by the character, and it's all informed by it's kind of like hard to know what came first.
It doesn't resort just to the basso buffo kind of melody for the big fat villain.
Right, it's not the cliche. It goes. It exceeds the cliche. Well, and I love you've spoken about this on this very podcast many times about John's incredible gift for writing idiomatically for every instrument in the orchestra, including very rarely heard instruments. What a great example. There's some with a great John Williams theme, it's not only that the melody and rhythm and underlying harmony is appealing, but it's often cast to an instrument in a perfectly idiomatic way. There's no competing.
And also in a way that, and if I can praise also the kind of virtuoso writing, because also he knows the sweet spot of an instrument, where does it sound good, but he also writes many times at the edges of what is possible with a certain
at the edge of the tessitura, where it.
And so
the high winds in a lot of the Star Wars material, but
he can do that in a way that it doesn't sound like he's stretching the muscles just for the sake of I want to just go out there with instrument, like in a concerto like mentality.
Right.
Especially in film music, is very very careful to still have it in a way that is presentable and sounds like it's easy.
I think that's a great point. Well, I think though in melodic instances, it's almost like you imagine, Puccini writing a great melody for a soprano or a tenor, where he's trying to, in Schindler's List, for instance, it's like he wants the violin to be weeping, and he wants it to get into those points where you feel the pulling and the tension. I mean, even in like the concert version of the Princess Leia's theme from Star Wars at the end, where the violin goes in the incredibly high register, you can tell that he's like eliciting a specific kind of emotion from that timbre. Or what Marty was talking about in Star Wars films, oftentimes he'll write the winds way high up, but usually there's a specific sound of like the E flat clarinet and its high register that's meant to kind of
meant to sound alien.
Yeah, or something. I think it's about such intention when writing idiomatically, and when it's, I guess, non-idiomatic in a traditional sense, it's intentional. It's it's meant to have if it's the oboe in a squeaky register, he wants it to be squeaky. It's not just because he wrote a high melody and he's like, well, the oboe sounds nice. There's always that great intention, and I think that's why so many performers love playing his music, because it's always so satisfying to play his music, because it's written for every instrument in a way that it's kind of like, I don't know, doing what that instrument
even
does
in
best.
string ostinati, if you actually look at the parts, there's some little appealing moment that takes it out of just the monotony of bowing.
As many people pointed out, he also writes with the player in mind. Sometimes for specific performers, he writes for them. But also, there is a little detail that you unveiled about the flying theme of ET. At one point, you have, I think, two flutes. They are playing the same. It's the same line of they are playing together, but not in unison. So the flute A is doing something, flute B is doing something else, and then the next beat, they switch. So flute A plays the what the flute B was playing, and you say just from the performance standpoint, it makes it more interesting to play, and that also shines through the performance.
Right.
Whereas I remember the interview Maurizio did with Cecilia Zan about sometimes the cellist going on stage today, opening the book and say, "Oh, okay, it's sustains notes, it's long
It's
notes,
easy
mild
day
notes,
on the stage.
whereas-
Yes.
Yeah, I heard that episode. That was wonderful. Well, I had the great fortune to study a bit with Conrad Pope, and I remember something he said about, say, like an orchestral tutti. It's like, let's say you have this fortissimo moment. Would you really hear the second bassoon? Possibly not. But how does that second bassoonist feel sitting out while the rest of the orchestra is in this energetic moment? And that psychology of the player is alive in Williams' music. And whenever you have the opportunity to look at the score level or the part level, you see that care. And it's really not surprising. I mean, there's a reason that I think all of us brothers and siblings and fans of John Williams' music continue to find so much fascination. We almost intuit that there's this level of care in the music.
Well,
that
I think
we're
particularly
hearing.
when you get to the concert arrangements that he's orchestrated himself, I feel like there even becomes a further level of awareness of the player's intention. You were talking about the flying theme from E.T. There's another great. It's very simple, but just the horns in that piece are just doing kind of the repeated note chordal, a very kind of simple part, a type of thing that French horn players are used to doing. But what I so marvel with John Williams is whenever there's an instrument doing a functional thing like that, maybe they're just playing something rhythmic or something chordal, he always finds ways of breaking apart the formula. So what I so love about in that flying theme, where the breath, because you need to give breath for the horn players to breathe, but he never has them breathing in the same spot twice. It's not like, what's interesting about it also, it's not meant to be totally invisible. It gives the part this kind of interesting rhythmic dance and kind of ballet to it, that it's slightly lopsided.
I think
and
the score
uncertain.
to Hook is full of this
Yeah.
kind of mastery
Absolutely.
in giving the instrument each player something juicy and or something that is not dull and repetitive, and spice it up, and it shines too because it's really, I mean, Hook is so colorful. It's almost he pulls every stuff possible. It's, what about? I was thinking, did you as musician, I think both composing but also performing, did you tackle many Williams's parts, growing up? Did you regularly maybe try to sink your teeth in John Williams's pieces when you were growing up, studying music, piano, or whatever other instruments you learned?
Yeah, I would sort of pray every night that my band director would program something. I remember playing a very interesting arrangement of "Can You Read My Mind" growing up, and then I think a couple of other moments. So I actually haven't really had the fortune to play much in sort of a formal setting, but it's interesting. That kind of brings you back again and again to your own instrument, your piano, or whatever it may be, to try to keep knocking your head against the wall and and seeing if you can kind of crack these harmonies, crack the figuration and the gestures that are happening in the music. But no, I mean, there are, I do just want to say there are some, I think, wonderful arrangements at all sort of levels for, in different band programs of some great John Williams arrangements.
I think for me, where his music most made the impact on that kind of intimate level, and it's probably my favorite level of, I guess, intimacy with a composer is, for me at least, trying to figure something out from memory. And with John Williams, the biggest challenge often for memory are those tricky little chromatic notes. Is it yum ba dum bum bum bum, or is it yum ba dum bum bum bum? And the reason that's especially tricky is because he does both in the score. But so it's like those little moments where you're like, both of these sound good. Which one is it? And the biggest thing for me was kind of discovering just a sheer level of joy that I discovered from figuring out some of his unique harmonic choices in a piece, whether it's something from E.T., like just sort of his delightful freedom of kind of wandering major seventh chords, or whether it's his sort of parallel minor triad chord language. And once you can kind of discover those paintbrushes and play around with them yourself as a composer, I think those are some of the most, for me, exciting moments where you feel like, oh, the world is wide open, in that these are no longer just very specific things attached to very specific pieces, but these are tools in and of themselves, in the way that, a bassoon has a sound. Well, his sort of minor chord paintbrush is its own sound that he's used in lots of scores, and other composers have used that to some degree. So finding those elements of his music, both through kind of score study, through listening, and just figuring out for fun. I think maybe when I was younger, those kind of really intimate moments where you're scratching your head and saying, is this really what it is? Like, I mean, I remember a moment that really always sticks out to me, the ending of the Raiders March, the bum, 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 where it's that sort of flat six to, it's the kind of chord progression. If you think in C major, it would be like A flat to B flat to C, yet each one of these chords is a major seventh chord.
Usually with the seventh on the bottom.
And figuring that out, I'm like, oh, I don't think I've ever heard that in a piece of music before, and it's completely the opposite of diatonicism. I mean, it's like, not only are neither of those chords in a major key, but they're not even, sometimes that progression will be described as, say, modal borrowing, that's borrowed from the parallel minor. But in that instance, each one of those chords being a major seventh chord doesn't fit within that reckoning, and you start to see his sort of harmonic freedom as just using chords as their own paintbrush in a way that composers like Debussy or Ravel sort of would. Yet he can also have the like formal structure of harmony of maybe more of a Germanic tradition. I don't know. These are things that were huge revelations, I think, to me, of that you can kind of combine and borrow from all these different traditions.
And how much of that, according to you, is also derived from his experience as a jazzman?
Right.
I think a lot of it. It's funny because I think we had a similar experience with being exposed to John Williams music as we were younger, where it felt like a portal to classical music was being opened in front of us. And I think what's often maybe not fully understood is the jazz context behind the great composers like Johnny Williams and Jerry Goldsmith and others who came up through kind of a TV pipeline and arranging, and had this arranging background. But there's just something I think about the power of the symphony orchestra, where it's very difficult to hear the jazz in it unless you're very clearly looking for it, or unless the orchestra kind of more overtly tips into that to that idiom. But I think it's hugely important, and I think a foundation in jazz harmony really goes a long way. One thing that's interesting about, if we could call them the rules of jazz, is that color and mood, I would say, dominate, and they sort of dictate what is, in quotes, right or wrong. And I think that's very much true in that example at that cadence in the Raiders March that Will's mentioning. Those major sevenths, they add this color that a jazz pianist or jazz arranger would be very comfortable with. And there's just this excitement of that jazz language coming into the orchestra. And yeah, I don't know that it's fully understood. I think the prevailing consensus around the impact of the Star Wars score is that it's this return to it's this neoclassicism. It's return to the classic film score, but there's an advanced jazz language. There's an advanced rhythmic language that, for my ear, is very American in John's case, and I think very fresh.
Joe Kramer, who was also a guest on your own podcast, which I had last year, and he mentioned specifically a section of the Star Wars, of the first Star Wars score, that he kind of was able to treat back to Miles Davis, A Kind of Blue. You know, the opening piece is so wild.
I love that.
And the opening chords of the very first piece of the Miles Davis album are very similar to a section in the on one of the scene on the Death Star in Star Wars. And that was probably very it was important to me to understand, because I think that era of jazzmen like Miles Davis or Gil Evans and people like that, who were very, very advanced in their own techniques, and not just playing but also in arrangements, were very fundamental, I think, for John Williams when he was a young kid, actually listening to that music.
The use of color, as Marty was describing it, I think is a big part of his approach. But then also so many of these different, I think, harmonic techniques and tricks that were in the ether. I mean, Miles Davis is someone who kind of his entire musical career flirts with all these different kind of quasi-jazz experiments, I guess you could call it. But the fact that so many, I think one of the reasons why John Williams' music is really hard to categorize or put into one specific box is that he's never just using one device. His music, I find, is never simply diatonic. It's never simply modal. It's never simply one thing or another thing. It's always filled with more levels of detail and color than almost any other kind of music you can find that's as accessible. And I think another thing that his jazz language was a tremendous influence is kind of his devotion to almost like a chaotic sense of surprise. And it's something that you notice, I find, like, if you ever listen to a jazz pianist play a really simple, beautiful ballad, whenever the melody returns to the one, when you're finally going to resolve, they almost always throw in some kind of surprising, jazzy, deceptive moment where maybe you think you're going to land on the one and it's actually this flat 2 major 7 chord, and then maybe they'll go to like the flat 6 major 9 or something. There's always this sense of surprise and dazzling, the way that they can kind of wind down into an ending. And I think that's something that John Williams has. I mean, I think of like the ending to a more recent score, like the BFG, all the little weird chromatic tones that he's playing on that flute to eventually resolve to an exhale. It's almost as though each member of the orchestra is so animated with color and so bouncy that to restrain them all, they're all still percolating and bouncing like popcorn. I mean, one of my favorite moments is in Superman. You get to that, and you know, the Superman march is one that is, you could think of just being about these pillars of stable chord tones, you know, the fifth and the root, bum 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 bum. It's so confident and strong, yet at the end of it, it has this just dizzying chromatic, almost atonal sort of flourish that happens at the end after the and then it goes into, And it's just like that's such a dizzying run, and it's hard to think of like, oh, that's Superman. Yum, bum, 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 bum,
I don't want to oversimplify, but listening to that really reminds me when watching the film as a little kid, and that recognizing that was the end of the piece and the movie is about to start. It puts you really in that feeling of excitement. So okay, it's about to start now. It's we are finally.
And how long can he delay that final second? That's like a big. I mean, like something. If you wanted to do a joke or a parody of, and one thing I think you maybe could satirize about John Williams is that he almost never wants it to end. That, and this is something. That
I love you mentioned that in your episode with Frank Lehman. The fun that John can have, particularly in the concert suites for these sort of fake out endings, and probably with the forest battle on Endor being the ultimate example of that. Was it 4 or 5 sort of fake out endings? He's just fantastic.
The fun thing of that Superman ending is that because I you almost have to sing along when you listen to one of his marches and more recognizable. Okay, which part I'm going to sing at the end, which part I'm going to try to sing along, where every section is just bubbling with excitement and chromaticism, and so it's very fun. Okay, now today I will do the melody of the trombones, and I will keep the rhythm of the trumpets. It's very fun. It's really rewarding to the ear. His confidence in using the extended harmonies, and sometimes you ask yourself, how does he know that? Because if it's not textbook harmonization, and if he's borrowing, you say, oh wait, I borrow a tone from the neighboring or the parallel minor. How does he know he can do that so freely? And I think jazz must be the answer. So probably all those years that, of course, it's probably natural talent and natural ear.
Yeah, I imagine that's part of it. And then also just his incredible experience on the ground as a session pianist in so many great scores. You have to imagine everything he gleaned from the Newman brothers or Conrad Salinger and others. There's a great clip where he's rehearsing a suite for Return of the Jedi with the Boston Pops. I can't remember what television program it was initially broadcast for. And he's doing some work for Temple of Doom while he's there in Boston. And they play just a tiny clip of him working on this action passage on the piano. And I can't believe there'd be any other human on the planet who could hear that and realize, yep, that'll sound great in the orchestra. It's very difficult, even for someone with maybe more of a jazz-leaning advanced ear, to kind of hear how those intervallic relationships are going to work. So, I mean, I think there's really no shortcut for the experience here.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we understood, we'd be making music like John Williams. I mean, I think that's that little. And what I love about those moments is, to me, those are windows into, I think, his true genius. Or it's almost like these are moments where it's like, I'm just going to give them a taste of what I'm capable of, but I'm always holding back a little. And I just those are the moments I'm so fascinated by. And he almost seems to delight in taking the most unrelated, seemingly discordant, disassociated pitches and making them catchy, memorable. I mean, even if you think of ba da 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 da. I mean, there's always this really daring sense of why those notes, but yet you hear it and it's like he finds a way to, if not logically, then emotionally justify it and support it by the way that the harmony shifts and pulls and resolves.
Return of the Jedi is also one of the first records. I think it was the first soundtrack we had on CD. I think I quite remember the day we found it in a shop and
I do too.
Went to our parents and I think, And so you listen to that, you are, I don't know, how old were we? I think I wasn't much older than
10 or 11, around that time.
And feeling perfectly comfortable that John Williams will lead you through this, melodic meandering without, always feeling very secure. So his melodic daring is never like for the sake of doing something out there.
Right.
And it's fascinating that he himself sometimes he's very fond of more avant-garde kind of thing. I think he recently in an interview with Alex Ross, he said maybe the kind of res inspired kind of music that he wrote for images is probably something that he would have ended up doing were he not maybe a successful film composer full time. But it's hard to believe because it's also so sincere when you listen to John Williams do his more accessible work. It never sounds like, oh, okay, it's doing a pastiche, it's slacking off and it's doing something easy, but no, it's fully there.
I think that's his way of being engaged, frankly. I think that shows why his work is so vital and is so strong, is that he loves it. He makes sure there's enough detail that he's getting a full balanced diet as well as the audience. And I think it keeps him engaged. And it's why some composers' music can feel a bit at an arm's length, because it's either reductive or it truly is a pastiche in the sense of it's not adding anything more stylistically than has already been there in the past. And that's why I get so frustrated when people try to label Williams' music as simply a pastiche, while there are clearly elements of many of his scores that are love letters to different composers or styles. I can't think of a single instance where he doesn't inject elements that are completely central and integral.
And there's never
style.
Autopilot. Yeah, even in the cues that kind of harken back to the temp music a little more overtly. When you actually get into the details of looking at the score, the voicings of the harmony, the casting of the harmony in the orchestra is always quite different from whatever you might have considered.
Well, even if you think of the cue in Home
piece.
Alone that's meant to be like the Russian dance. I mean, the harmonies in there are just almost in the first 5 seconds. Okay, Tchaikovsky would never do that. You have these parallel planing major chords. Tchaikovsky wouldn't write like that, yet it's very clearly a nod to that. But he isn't simply doing a sound alike to this other composer. And it's the same thing if it's meant to be Stravinsky. He's still
perspiring and working quite hard through those moments. I think it's a really interesting question. How interested, how passionate is John about these infectious, almost pop level melodies? And if we're to take him at his word from interviews, it would seem as though this kind of happened by accident. It was this turn in his career he didn't really plan for. I'm sure there's some truth in that, but I have to agree with Will. At least in my experience, I don't think any artist can really excel at something that they don't truly love. And just the corpus of these melodies is really just astonishing.
I think it was Richard Dyer, the Boston Globe former music critic, that followed him very closely when he went to Boston and followed him, growing as a music director of the Boston Pops. That in an interview he said about John Williams that the key quality of his music is honesty, actually, because he never wrote at this honest note in his entire career, in the sense that when you hear music of heroic resolve, is because he's feeling that heroic resolve. If he's writing music that carries a lot of romantic or even erotic sense of passion, is because he's feeling that. Never resorts to to cheap tricks or to simplistic way of because agree. He could do sometimes make his life a lot easier in many ways to resort to common things or common languages in terms of musical solutions, but he always tried to put something extra, even in the simplest cues, or even in the most boring scene that he has to score, because that's what I think he is. He's a reactive composer.
And when you look at any of the projects he's actively seeked out, it almost seems like he's looking for challenge. If you think of something like Memoirs of a Geisha, where it's like he's going out of his way to push himself into new territory, or even like any of the comments he's made about how, you know, he's a composer who loves doing rewrites and he likes working hard. And that's something that for me, I can hear that as like that's a nice thing you're supposed to say. But if that's something someone genuinely feels, I can't relate to something less. Like, he enjoys having to do more work for himself and to throw out amazing things that he like. I think that just shows the level of integrity that he has as an artist, but just as a person. He's a really hard worker and always wants to approach things genuinely. I think that also goes in line with his sort of rule for himself about how he doesn't like to read scripts, and he doesn't want to know too much about the movie and what it's supposed to be and what the score is supposed to be until he sits down and watches the cut, because I think he wants to have that genuine emotional reaction, because that emotion is where the music comes from.
And that relates also to what we were saying before about the power of his music to young people, even to kids, is because and you were saying so beautifully before about the fact that he's able to, to strip down to the core essential elements and make maybe a really beautiful 4, 5, 6 note theme or motif, and that is what is working. And for him is a very hard work, because it means peeling and strapping things away,
Right.
But at the same time he's able to to ransom the simplicity of the material in a way through this advanced, more complex orchestral solution, or a more interesting harmonic texture on the bottom. So that is very important for him to find this balance, and that's why also I think his music is so rich and so full of discovery. Even pieces that we know by heart after listening to them for so many years, even the March from Superman or the Flying Theme from E.T., there is always something that pops out suddenly, even at the 200th listen to that piece, so okay, he's doing that thing, and it keeps you engaged, and it keeps you interested in finding surprises, and that's something really a gift that he has as a composer, as an artist.
Well, and I love what that shows is possible with the art of film score. For me, one of the things I find most exciting about John Williams' film work is that it often, through all of its incredible detail, complexity, and beauty, it suggests a world beyond the frame that we won't ever see, that sometimes is barely audible or frankly inaudible. But the philosophy of that, of putting that work into something that won't be heard or seen, that just it stirs me, and it's so inspiring. It's I think in the Steve Jobs biography by Walter Isaacson, I think they talk about how with the first Macintosh they developed, there was an engraving, I think, on the inside of the shell of the computer that was signed by all of the team that worked on it. And this is something that essentially no user of the machine would ever see, but there's that similar philosophy of, I know I did it. And I've got to say, I think that interesting kind of aesthetic of there being this detail beyond what's discernible and extending beyond the frame, I think that's a huge part of why the original Star Wars was so successful. A lot has been said about the visual aesthetic and how George went for this lived-in, worn-down world, and I think that's brilliant. But John's music evokes that, this world has existed for centuries. It really is a long time ago. There really are all of these vast cultures. And you don't have to suspend any disbelief. You're almost explicitly experiencing it through the music.
The other thing that is just so... John Williams is so motivic. He writes so many themes. Even the themes that he wouldn't call themes are themes. Like within a single cue, yeah. One little motive that was once a counter melody then returns in a different, altered form, and it's like, okay, now that's its own character and its own theme. And I remember several years ago, Marty and I rewatching Hook together and being like, this has to be the most number of motifs or themes that are associated with characters and ideas of any film ever. I mean, not only are there so many, song-like melodies in the score, but there are all these smaller motifs. I mean, it's unbelievable, and so many of his scores are that way.
One of my children was looking at Last Crusade the other day.
Mm-hmm.
The beginning of them is incredible because at one point he me, is there a theme for the Cross of Coronado? And I say yes, it's da 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 da. And I say, but it's also for the Panama Hat guy. Dun, 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 dun. And then you start seeing that, and then you have, of course, you have dun 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 dun, the theme for the first adventure. But then you have all this little fanfare. At one point, the orchestra goes, the brass goes, da-da-dun, da-dun, da-dun, dun, 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 dun. And that could be a theme in and of itself.
It's so strong, and he just throws it away in one time. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you have also the sneaking up to the cross theme. Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah.
It's almost a melodic kind of interest. I mean, it's so full. It's like it's throwing a lot of themes.
Well, it's almost like when he does it that way, it's music meets prose. It's like people having a dialogue or discussion together, because each one of those melodies is almost like a word. And then by juxtaposing them all together, you create a sentence or something.
I mean, a very economical score of this is for his Minority Report. I understand that it was written maybe a lot faster than usual, and it's a score that relies a lot more on color, but it's an absolutely fine score. It doesn't think that is subpar or that is doing. It's just it decided to use a more, let's say, Herman or Goldsmith approach. Okay, I cannot. Maybe the film doesn't even require that richness and generosity of thematic material, even though the main theme of the Sean theme is absolutely
the Sean theme
gorgeous.
Haunting.
So he could do that. You can think, okay, I can do that also in Indiana Jones. I go for a more economical approach at least in terms of melody, but it doesn't. And especially the second and the third Indiana Jones, I think, are rife with thematic ideas that are just presented once.
That's also the nature of the movies themselves. I mean, he always, as I was saying before, he's very a reactive composer. As I think it was Doug Adams that used that term in the discussion we did together for the latest Star Wars movie.
The Star Wars discussion.
Yes, and he's a reactive composer. I mean, he finds the right musical translations for the sense, for what he's seeing, of course, but also the overall sense of the movie. And the Indiana Jones films are, of course, over the top, and everything is exaggerated, and everything is so heightened in terms of of temperature, emotional temperature, but action temperature. And so the music follows suit. The music has to heighten constantly everything we see on screen. I mean, from the tiniest detail to the most bloated action sequence, but the music has to follow that kind of sense of, and he's always very, very careful. He's not just writing, colorful or rich music because because he can, but always because he has to follow a precise aesthetic route. And he's always very careful about that. And I think that one of the things that was essential for him to build this with so much confidence was the fact that he has directors like Steven Spielberg besides him that really trust him and say, "Go for it, John. Don't worry. You can write basically anything you feel is right for the film."
Right. That's such a good point. That power that he has been bestowed, maybe graciously, by a director like Steven Spielberg is so important to the film's success. And I think a plea that I would make to more contemporary directors and producers and anyone in the more administrative side of film production would be to give composers the chance to have that type of freedom, because I really think films are capable of a kind of liftoff, of a kind of excitement, and reaching kind of like an 88 miles per hour in the DeLorean that they're not allowed to when the music has to do sort of the bare minimum to not offend what is happening on the visuals, or the bare minimum to not get in the way of any other aspect.
Right.
And when John is able to be let free, I mean, I think that opening, the first few reels of Last Crusade, I think could stand up to any kind of first movement of a Bruckner symphony or a Mahler symphony. I mean, like, that could be his great symphonic work. That first, I mean, just not just all the motifs, but just the dazzling writing of all of that's the thing that's so amazing, is you can listen to the music on its own.
Yeah.
And it's just
and that period,
so full.
that post pops or mid pops period, where he's even more daring with his orchestration, I would argue, and the harmonic vocabulary.
The Witches
really,
of Eastwick. I think The Witches of Eastwick is probably really a pivotal score in his career. And I was watching the movie a few days ago because I caught it by chance on television the other night, and I started to watch it again.
Were you able to restore the lost cues?
Yeah. No, but the fact that he could have gone a much more easy route for that movie. I mean, and so I questioned myself, and I said, why he went so rich for a movie that could have maybe a much more banal music.
Well, I think if you look at the films that John would have grown up with, or if you're just a fan of classic cinema, I think it's clear where John's going. The great scores of Steiner or Waxman, or Korngold, they're doing the kind of thing that we're talking about, where they evoke more than is audible. Some of that is really the limitations of recording at the time. It wasn't possible to hear all of that in the orchestra. And I almost have the impression that Williams' orchestration, say from sort of the blockbuster period onward, it's kind of his memory of how those scores sounded, but it's actually more animated, more dense, more vivid than those scores. Similarly to how Star Wars and Indiana Jones are meant to evoke the storytelling and the acting and the plot of those old serials, but they're also more vivid. And so it's just this great match. We're in a weird period now, to kind of go along with what Will was saying, where I think we have cases where the filmmaking is maybe even further in that direction of vivid and exciting. And I know I find it challenging to have the scores sometimes feel like they're not on that same trajectory. Not that, we should just pursue dense orchestration with no limits or no rhyme or reason. But I think for those of us that have grown up with the films of the 80s, like we're talking about, there can be some dissonance with the approach in a lot of those scores. Whereas I imagine older audience members of the films we're talking about in the 70s and 80s would have related to John's scores. They wouldn't have been far afield from what they would have grown up with.
I think that there is a misconception nowadays, because a lot of film composers like to call themselves or be labeled by their collaborators as filmmakers. Because they like to be involved very early on in the process, and they start writing music based on the script, and they like to talk a lot with the director and starting to get out ideas, which is absolutely fine. But more often than not, especially, and I'm talking about mostly the Hollywood blockbuster scene, you feel like that the end result is a huge compromise, and not in the best sense of the word.
In the sense that the music is hugely compromised.
Absolutely, and that's because more often than not, the filmmakers aren't able to trust their composers to let them maybe go to a different route, or because they like to to make them sure that they follow the guide track, or they have to not to move too much beyond what has been established, or maybe the director has very, very precise musical ideas that he or she wants to stick on to.
I would argue that maybe it's just the opposite problem. To me, maybe there is a kind of a lack of self-assuredness, how can I say, of confidence for the aesthetics. We were talking about this, Maurizio and I, offline, about like a lot of aesthetic choices, like in the photography today, are left in post. Now you shoot with
Sure.
an open lens, you just catch whatever you can, and then you make your aesthetic
You
choices
grade it
later on,
later.
because the
Yeah.
tools nowadays allow that. And so you do not commit to a specific aesthetic. And I think that musically it's also a little bit the same. It's like, I don't know what to commit to a specific aesthetic, but at the end you just do a kind of common denominator kind of music that could be okay if it's a superhero movie, or it's a spy movie, or maybe it's because to me there must
Or a
be a difference
trailer.
between, for instance, yeah. No, because I was thinking there must be a difference if you're doing Ghostbusters, okay, which is maybe it's something which has element of the fantastic, and it has to be a little bit grounded, but it's a comedy. And it's very important, for instance, that the music does a specific thing. Maybe he's playing the straight man against the comedy. But if you're doing a superhero movie with a lighthearted superhero movie, it's not the same thing. It's not a
Right.
comedy. For instance, or I think also Back to the Future is great because it's essentially a comedy. Robert Zemeckis said that he tried to use a lot of things he learned from Billy Wilder, but yet the music doesn't make me think of an old Billy Wilder
Right.
comedy, but
The
it's a
music is
really, really
Amblin,
robust
80s.
music that has to support a specific aspect without being too, of course, too heavy. And so, but those kind of aesthetic choices to me are not longer made. It's almost like because no aesthetic choice
Well,
is
and the
made.
problem is that people don't appreciate the degree to which those aesthetic choices make a particular film immortal. Like what you just said is such a profound point that I don't even think I've considered. If you had a different kind of score to Back to the Future, it might be perceived as a completely different kind of film. We might put it in the category of The Odd Couple rather than in the category of, like, I put it up there with almost like 80s action sci-fi movies, but it isn't one of those. But I put it in that category because of Alan's incredible score. I think.
It's very interesting to note that Back to the Future was actually Alan Silvestri had to tone down a little bit his music. If you listen to his early version of Several Cues, he went a lot more bombastic actually, and so because he was told, Alan, go big. The film had to look big to be like a supercharged blockbuster movie, while it was essentially a comedy. And so
the special effects budget was mostly the score.
Exactly. So he went big, but when they put the music against the picture, they realized that maybe it's a little bit too much. Let's tone down just a notch. I mean, he didn't rewrite the whole piece,
because it's not scoring sword fights or anything.
Yeah. So and that was, I think, another great lesson, because you don't have to. Sometimes the key ingredient is something very thin, is something very even impalpable in some way. So it's a very, very hard job to find the right music for a movie.
Well, I think you both make excellent points. Both Gianmaria's point about there being kind of like a non-committal attitude towards aesthetics, and Maurizio, I think you're also right in the sense of not putting that sort of trust and faith in a composer. I do think a lot of filmmakers almost resent the in that particular case between Bob Zemeckis and Alan Silvestri, or a Spielberg-Williams relationship where so much runway is allowed for the composer to allow the film to soar. I do think a lot of filmmakers want the movie to succeed or fail on their stuff, and they maybe feel uncomfortable with the music kind of being in there in the mix. But like, just to get to your earlier point about aesthetics, I do think the issue with not allowing a composer the freedom to kind of carry the film in that really vital and present way is, I don't think movies are as exciting as they could be. I don't think they're as joyous. They're not as memorable. They're not as fun as they can be. And they don't have that kind of heart and through line that Spielberg-Williams film is able to have, because the music is, I mean, in many cases, 50% of the film. I mean, it would be like, to me, it's film needs to be thought of more as a medium like opera. You wouldn't go to an opera and put earplugs in and just focus on the staging and just focus on the whatever choreography is there and the costume design and the set. It's like you go for the music. And I think there's as much in the classic films, there's as much of a vital role that the score plays. And I also think for the types of composers that I think a lot of modern filmmakers really kind of want their composers to be like. A lot of people praise Bernard Herrmann because I think he was edgier, he was darker, and he was kind of ahead of his time when it comes to this sort of minimalist idea for scoring. But the thing is, the score for Psycho didn't exist because he had to make 15 versions of each cue and was told, take the melody out on this one. And you know what? We're going to take this cue from the end here and we're going to put it in the beginning without telling you.
Yeah. And, he actually went against the director's wishes.
Yeah, he was a strong kind of bull in a china cabinet guy that had really intense opinions. So I kind of don't think that, I don't know, he's not the right appropriate analog for contemporary film music.
Except, for instance, of course, there is George Lucas and Steven Spielberg or Zemeckis, our director, that are very comfortable with, because they know they need the music to do certain heavy lifting. And I think the only other filmmaker I can think of that had that kind of confidence is kind of Walt Disney, who totally knew how important was the score. But of course, in the past, maybe it was different. But in the studio system period, the director maybe wasn't involved in the scoring part. Maybe was already going and shooting something else. What made me angry, for instance, is that a director, for instance, whose aesthetic I love and who is very cognizant of the power of music in movies, for instance, Quentin Tarantino, who doesn't allow, he said, I cannot trust a composer to do the best job. I need to compose the score with my record collection. He did well the Eightfold Eight with Morricone, fortunately.
But you know that, sorry to interrupt, but you know that when he
ended up using the thing
exactly, because when he asked Morricone to score A Hateful Eight, basically what he wanted was Morricone doing Western music, and Morricone said, "No, I won't do that."
No, but what I think, but at the end, the film is a better film for Morricone doing his own stuff. Of course, maybe I'm biased then because Morricone, of course, was a composer of such stature that you wouldn't maybe try to contradict him. But what I was saying is that what made me a little bit angry with his approach, even though I love him as a filmmaker, is that a lot of choices that he now uses in his movies are from other scores. It is music that didn't exist at once until a composer did it for a movie. So why can't he trust a very talented composer, and there are plenty, to do that with one of his movies? There is a kind of a really feel of entitlement on your movie, and I can understand a little bit, the author theory. And I think, for instance, sometimes Martin Scorsese seems to be like the same way, but it's kind of a sad state of affair that now almost every director has the same feeling of authorship that has to be all-encompassing.
Right, and very few of them have that taste that Tarantino does, where I think I share some of your feelings in general about preferring an original score, but I have to admit that Tarantino has incredible taste when it comes to his needle dropping and use of existing music. I wonder, though, if that's necessarily a great influence on filmmaking in general for directors that maybe don't have that same musical
with Tarantino, there's
touch.
like a specific kind of aesthetic, and there's a style to his filmmaking that I think is more akin to kind of like the advent of hip hop and sampling, where he's almost like doing a riff on so many older genres, and so much of his work is such a love letter to the history of film. I think he likes using all those.
The same argument for Star Wars. Star Wars could have worked with a patchwork soundtrack from old serials and other scores of classical music. That would have been a very postmodern kind of, even more postmodern.
The specific sound of like the almost record scratchy, old-fashioned sound is what Tarantino wants, almost more than the style of the music. It's the fact that this is actually from some old 70s, film. It's more about, I think,
the intertextual kind of value.
Yeah, to me, it's more that.
That's
what I get from his movies. But the problem that I have is what I at least like about Tarantino's films is everything in the filmmaking is edited in such a way and timed in such a way that those cues are so effective and they work so well in the film.
Yes.
My problem now with a lot of contemporary film scores, and I don't want to name examples, but Marty and I were actually just talking about this earlier this morning. So often I get frustrated watching films where there's an original score, they hired a composer, and the music sounds as though it was just needle dropped, pre-existing music, because the music is not supporting
the ostinati continue
tension.
Through tender dialogue or something that.
I mean, I was watching a movie recently where the whole opening scene of the film, I couldn't tell if what was happening in the scene I was meant to be engaged with, because the music was doing the same thing it was doing over the opening titles, and it was so loud and present, and this is part of the score, and it gave me the feeling of like, if you were watching a stage play and you had original, interstitial music between the scenes, if the music carries into the next scene and you have people coming in and speaking, but the music's still going on in the same kind of mood it was when the curtains were out, it's like, it just feels wrong to me. And because of people like Tarantino and so many filmmakers that do needle drop songs and score like that, to me at least, internalize a kind of language of how music works with cinema. And there's composers nowadays that seem to just be completely ignorant to that. So I feel like, why even hire a composer if they're not going to do the job of supporting what's happening moment to moment? Yeah, not just general blanket mood like a video game that you can put over the whole thing, but that kind of moment to moment.
And also, to kind of turn back to John, I would say not merely the simplest mood possible, the simplest mood reaction. Oh, they're inspired, so it's female voices and Lydian kind of chord oscillation. I think one of the things I love maybe most about John Williams' music is how often I'm encountering an emotion I have no language for. It's not a simple emotion. It's not happy or sad. And it's fascinating looking often at the chord constructions to some of those great moments. And again, I can, I guess, only speak for myself, but that's something that I'm hungry for if I'm engaging with a piece of art. I don't merely want simple emotions reflected for that 90 minutes.
The Last Crusade, when Donovan dips his cup in the water, what happens in the score there is so perfect, and like that moment sticks in my mind in there's like such a putrid quality to what happens in the music there. That's like it foreshadows what's about to happen when he drinks the cup, but it's like also at the same time, I mean, it reminds me of like Charles Ives, where it's almost as though there are two pieces of music happening at once in different valences, where there's like the beauty of the water and that golden goblet, and yet the horror of
this interruption. It's piercing it.
It's just brilliant.
And also because it happens after you see this beautiful textures in the strings, where it's very suspended, very kind of religioso kind of writing.
They're kind of reflecting the ostentatious appearance of this goblet. But again, this I think all goes to, I like what you said, Maurizio, about how earnest John's music is. Every note is earnest, really. And I love just the emotional moments that we get from that. I mean, I think one of my very favorites is the reveal of Indiana Jones and Raiders, which is this terrifying, almost horror movie monster, but it's so emotionally right. I can't imagine any composer being able to get that through in a contemporary film today. It's, what are you doing? This emotion doesn't make sense. This is our hero. Don't you understand? He's on the poster. You can't do that.
But even the old-fashioned composers that we're told are kind of like, oh, Williams is just, redoing all these people from the past. There's just, there's no way that there's no way that Robin Hood is going to get revealed in that way. You know what I'm saying? It's like John Williams may have harmonic and orchestrational style language that evokes people from the past, but the way in which he utilizes all these elements.
His storytelling instincts are so unique.
Yeah.
And that's maybe what I look forward to most in a new John Williams score is I want to just sit in awe of his taste and his choices and his personality.
Yes, and basically in Raiders, actually, he was channeling very consciously, Max Steiner, basically, because the whole score is basically a love letter to Max Steiner.
Something like King Kong. Especially.
Yeah, especially exactly the way he introduces Indiana Jones in the first scene when he's revealed after the
stepping out of the shadows.
Exactly, it scores almost like he's King Kong.
Right. Yeah. Dun 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 dun. Bam, bam.
Those heavy low brass and trombones.
Right. And you see that same instinct at the end of Force Awakens, that reveal of Luke.
Yeah.
But boy, is it beautiful. It's somehow right to be feeling terrified in that moment. And I wouldn't be able to put words on it, and it's something that you wouldn't think to describe that way as a novelist, but it's again the power of music to be counterintuitive in that way.
Yeah, but what's also great about combination of cinema music is that whether the scene was cut with music in mind, of knowing that the music had to do something, the music sings very specific images, and then you remember the shots that accompany maybe a specific bar of music, and even maybe I remember one thing. I don't know if you did that when you were young, but when listening to the score, Maurizio and I, when we were very young, we tended to try to reenact kind of the movie on our own. Yeah. And of course, but certain things, even though we maybe just saw the movie once in the movie theater before we could get hold of the VHS, certain specific moments will stick out. And of course, on one hand, would you have maybe Spielberg, a very secure and inventive direction that is very iconic, how to frame a shot in an iconic way, but also the music helps you to imprint certain things, and so not just the atmosphere, but sometimes you remember the shot, and the kind of marriage of music and movie that I see less and less. I don't want to be too disparaging or something.
You'll see it in animation still.
Yeah. In animation, because animation seems to still be needing that, and but if I think sometimes you have this kind of sense of missed opportunity when watching, and also also on TV, because for instance, one thing I noticed is that the quality maybe of the TV production is now very high. But yet, maybe because of production considerations and timings, sometimes I wish maybe the music could have been even more particular, more full of character.
Yeah, I mean, so much television music is like almost entirely textural and devoid of pitch material that is not just memorable, but like it makes you aware of it on any level. I mean,
I think that is a very conscious decision on parts of filmmakers and producers to have scores that are very, this is a word I hate, unobtrusive. They have to be very, very in the background, not just distracting you, because the way nowadays people mostly watches TV shows and even movies nowadays is very different. It's because they mostly watches in piecemeal fashion. I watch 10 minutes now, and maybe I'll stop, I'll do another thing, and then I resume playing after a while, or maybe I'm doing some other things. I'm watching, and then I'm also texting on my smartphone and things like that, which are probably very far from our own generation and people who grew up, going to movie theaters a lot and, enjoying even the experience.
It's funny how quickly those trends change, though, because you can go back to a show from, like, I've been rewatching Scrubs recently, which is a comedy from kind of the early 2000s, and it's funny how just musically old-fashioned, they have that whenever a tender moment, this little piano thing, dun 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 dun, and it just makes me think of like Full House, when they have that like tender moment.
Just a more innocent.
Leave It to Beaver. You have the learning moment, and they bring the theme in on the string slow, and that's like the moment where you are meant to put all the pieces together. And it's just like, I can't think of anything like this in film. But you used to watch The Simpsons, and Lisa would be sad, and then you hear yada yada yeah, and these really kind of jazzier chords that are unsatisfying and sad. And
I mean, I think it's really important to say it's. I think those of us that love a very present, a score that's doing a lot of heavy lifting in a piece, we can bemoan some of these trends. But there's almost always more going on behind the scenes. And just thinking about it this way, if nearly every television show you're watching has this kind of background score that you're talking about, how easy do you think it would be to get a cue approved that isn't that way? If the producers of this show want their material to stand alongside the latest Netflix or whatever, it's extremely difficult. And I do think the next generation of composers are going to be men and women that have mastered the ability of evoking that background thing and finding a way to get some thematic material in there. And I think some of the best working composers do that. I still, of course, wish that there would be more real estate given to the score, but it's a new challenge. And on optimistic days, I try to look at this period as more of a transitionary period, hopefully.
Well, because the language of film visually has so changed, the language of editing and everything. It's like you can't just put an 80s score into a modern film. But to me, the solutions that we've arrived at don't seem like solutions at all. It seems like a lot of, let's just get rid of a lot of the music.
And sometimes, I mean, at least to me, and when someone tried to do that, put a very conscious 1970s, 80s type of score in a current movie, it feels, most of the times, it doesn't feel earnest. Right. It feels like we are, actively and very consciously trying to evoke that feeling in a way that is too much winking to the audience, if you know what I mean. Right.
Absolutely.
And that probably turns as something that couldn't last too much, because when the things aren't done in the most honest or earnest way possible, probably they don't last.
I think it's like I at this point I'd be so happy for just any moderate concession in the direction of some element of what we used to have. So that's like, whether if it's a score that has somewhat of a memorable theme, even if the scoring approach seems maybe by the books of the modern standards, or something that maybe it doesn't have a memorable theme. I feel this about a lot of younger composers now, where it's like the score itself is actually kind of rich and has a quasi-symphonic approach to it that's interesting, but there's not necessarily any memorable melody that I could leave the theater humming. But I'm just happy to get at least some kind of attempt in a different sort of direction, a direction away from sort of what I consider to be the least amount of music. It almost seems like in many cases the directive is, what's the least amount of music we can have without having no music.
Well, I think a necessary path is exposure to music outside of film score. And we mentioned kind of early on in the conversation how the Superman album or the Jedi album or whatever were these portals into orchestral music, classical music. I just think the reality is each decade, fewer and fewer people listen to that music. There's not a reference point for music that develops, that tells a story. And so if the only music in your iPhone is more record, pop music, why would it develop? Why would the musical language work in that way.
It is funny though, because then shouldn't it have a melody? Shouldn't it have a really catchy melody? Shouldn't it be like syncopated and have some kind of groove element to it that's infectious? What I find so interesting about a lot of modern film music is rhythmically it's so much less interesting than what John Williams is doing. It's so very square, you know.
But I think that's because it's very easy, to change things on the spot. Actually, when you have a movie that is constantly changing and sequences are juggling, and things like that. If you have that kind of modular type
and again,
of composing,
this is what the samples of 10 years ago were able to execute very well. And if you needed your cues approved, you needed your demos approved, you're not going to spend, honestly 15 more hours to mock up this nimble violin line that you're not going to get to sound very convincing. I'm hopeful on that front as well, as the tools have really developed. I mean, even every year it's amazing the progress that we're making there.
Because what I wonder if is that the kind of discipline that is the discipline for music theoretically shouldn't have changed. The music should still have the same kind of role, not the style, but it should still be needed as it was needed 80 years ago to do something, to be an integral part of the drama. But the fact that all the way a score come to be recorded is completely changed. The question of approval, of mocking up, the kind of tools that you have at your disposal, the timing, the budget's restraint. I mean, a lot of things. And not that in the past there weren't compromises that had to be made, but I think that there were certain aspects that still required craft. And so it was kind of built in. Craft was built in because it was something that you couldn't do without. Nowadays, maybe there are the kind of competences that are required to be able to record a score are completely changed than what was necessary 30 years ago. And so maybe a very promising, talented counterpuntal kind of composer who can write fugues like it's nothing, who doesn't know how to work with a producer, probably wouldn't have stand the chance to offer his talents to the film community. So I think that there is the kind of skill set is now different, and maybe it's also tougher because nowadays you need to be if you really want to excel, you need to be both a great composer and arranger, but also have all those other skills at your disposal. And also
and I do think we're solving problems that had never really been adequately solved in the past. The way it worked is that the director trusted in the composer, or in the early days of say Hollywood, the music department at a place like MGM. And so, I play the thing on the piano, you got to just trust me. So if someone would have asked, well, how can I really get a sense of what it is you've written before going to the scoring stage? There was no solution. And that's I think a central question we've been wrestling with for the past couple of decades. And I think it has a lot to do with the kind of scores that we have. And again, I'm hopeful about where we are sort of in this moment. And I'm also so excited that we had these 3 new John Williams Star Wars scores, in the decade that just passed, that, if someone is never going to listen to Scarlatti or Bach, but they're going to hear March of the Resistance and they're going to be exposed to fugal writing, that's fantastic. That can only be a good thing.
That type of richness can not completely disappear from the popular culture. I mean, I think of a movie like Mary Poppins Returns that not just had incredible songs and songwriting of a bygone era, but a score that was incredibly rich. And there's no shortage, I think, of great scores for animated films, as long as there's some places in our popular culture where that kind of richness can exist. I think I think it's too good of a thing for it to die out entirely.
But there is an interesting question when if the prevailing instrumental music is only for media, what are kind of the long-term effects of that? Whereas in the early days of cinema, instrumental music is referencing existing concert music. I think it's safe to say very few people listen to any contemporary concert music. The dominant instrumental music is for media. Does that have the effect of sort of a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox as we kind of move through the decades? I'm not sure.
There are contemporary composers now who are being inspired by film music, but that doesn't necessarily just regurgitate the mannerisms of film music. They just try to absorb what what the film music had to offer, and then just re-engineer that for the concert hall. Sadly, in this historical period, now the concert hall has an uncertain future. So let's hope that once the current situation is resolved, that maybe a new front can be given to public events, and that maybe we also rediscover the great also can I say that the circumstantial music, maybe I still hope that maybe we will go celebrate maybe the next once we will have this pandemic behind our back, then maybe we want to celebrate also with some great music written for some special occasions, and that maybe can.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It would be so inspiring to see kind of a movement towards really fun concert music being written, music meant to engage people and to celebrate our hopeful but inevitable return to kind of mass gatherings and congregating. I think there'd be just cause for something that, because I think to be fair, for nearly a century, the kind of Western classical contemporary concert scene has almost seemed to kind of delight or revel in the fact that like it's such a small audience, and almost it communicates the sense that it's like, well, you're just not smart enough or sophisticated or learned enough to understand what it is that we're doing here. But really, I mean, I think the true value of any, not just concert music, but anything in front of an audience, is to get the energy of all those people in one place and to have them become one entity. That's why I so miss going to movies in these recent months, because there's that feeling of an audience where you're on a journey together and you kind of don't know each other, you're strangers, but in those 2 hours or however long you're together and you're experiencing the same thing over the stretch of time. And there's something magical that happens, that I think happens in any kind of live setting for music or stand-up comedy or theater or any sort of situation where there's a live audience. I think it's incredibly powerful.
And in this sense, trying to to sum up what we said so far, what do you think, guys, will be John Williams' music role in the future? In this sense, do you think it's already placed into the canon of great orchestral music of our tradition?
I think that's a fantastic question, and I would say that's part of what's motivated us making the podcast. Is I still feel that at the moment there's very little for those of us that love scores to view them fully as a piece of art. We can be extremely thankful to Mr. Mike Matessino and all of the wonderful soundtrack re-releases that we've been given in the last decade or two. But really, there's nothing, nearly nothing approaching the kind of study we could have over a Wagner opera or, say, Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty or something like that. Now, it's possible there will be those sorts of resources, that kind of study decades from now. That's probably more common, actually, if we look at the history of musical analysis and and study and appreciation. But I think what all of us in the film music podcast space are trying to do in our own way is to celebrate this music and also to sort of understand it. And I still very much want to see the medium of film score duly celebrated and understood as its own work of art. But it's a very difficult thing to do. For one, it's a very long piece of art. In some cases, 2.5, 3 hours. There are some significant scores that fall in that range. There's a lot of material, whether we're talking about viewing scores or listening to the audio. And also something that we've tried to focus on our show is it does not exist in a vacuum. So it also needs to be understood in the context of the film. And as you get deeper into it, you need to understand the context of the making of the film. So it can be quite an undertaking. It's understandable that there aren't many materials when it comes to studying a full score, let's say. But what I hope is that to coin your term, that the legacy of John Williams' music will be this incredible treasure trove of a resource of study of composition and also emotional musical storytelling. And I look forward to the day when, there can be, around the globe, many John Williams courses that will be able to focus maybe on a single score. We'll have the score materials, we'll have the audio materials. Obviously, there are some copyright hurdles that make a lot of that difficult currently, but that's what I look forward to when I think about the future of John Williams. I also look forward to him living to the age of 224 or whatever.
No, but the fact that he's donated also all of his material to the Juilliard School of Music is, I think it's a good sign.
Fantastic.
to probably he's kind of aware that probably his music will be studied and looked a lot and by future music students and musicologists also.
Well, and I think I hope beyond simply the study of music. I mean, I do think his name should absolutely be on the Mount Rushmore of great classical composers, but his name should be on the Mount Rushmore of film.
Should be right on the Hollywood sign.
Yeah, I mean, I think
actually it can be based on your drawing, Gianmaria.
Well, because the whole
That
thing
would
about
be great.
his number of Oscar nominations, he's always say, he's just behind Walt Disney in terms of the number of Oscar nominations. But the interesting thing I think he's a figure like Disney, yet, Disney didn't hand animate every single cell in all of the films he was a producer. John isn't, not to disparage anybody that I'm naming here, but he isn't like a Hans Zimmer where he has a slew of other composers and he's more like the overall spiritual leader of the. No, he writes every single note and he creates everything for all of his scores. I mean, I just don't think he is in the canon of classical composers in terms of how prolific he is. I mean, you look at how Schubert, he didn't live very long, but he left so much music. I mean, had he lived as long as Beethoven, I can't even imagine, how many symphonies we'd have. And
how many of the classical composing legends conducted as much of their own music or as music of others? I mean, there's a case from someone like Mahler maybe and some others, but I mean, when you look at just the length of John Williams' career, it's incredible. So it's not only that ink on the page. I think I remember Conrad Pope saying something about, I think as Joanne Kane was preparing the final sheets for the Sorcerer's Stone and the Philosopher's Stone on your side of the pond, I think they were able to do like a note count, and it was over 1 million notes in the score. And to think that each of those or nearly each of those, I guess there would have been orchestral doubling and stuff, would have been written by the man himself, and then he would have gone into those sessions hours each day conducting. It's something.
And I think that a lot of the musicians I'm talking to in the latest podcast, every one of them told me about how good John a conductor is. I mean, every one of them, even the more experienced musicians, told me that he's very, very one of the best conductors in the business, because he always arrives very prepared. He doesn't let anything, slip in under, some circumstance. So that's something probably that's not quite known, I think, even among fans. We know he is more public conductor persona, but not just the role of him as a conductor in studio.
And what does it take to bring that music to us? It takes, as I think, there was a great story, I think, in a recent podcast about, actually trombone, that's an F natural, not an F sharp. It takes that sort of ear that the gentleman still has to be able to execute those cues on time and deliver them into
that's such a good point, because I think conducting, I'm not qualified, I think, to say this, but obviously, if it hasn't been said enough before, conducting is so much more than waving your arms around with a baton. It really, I think, has more to do with the listening than the physical. And I think, John, any footage I've ever seen of him leading a scoring stage, I mean, first of all, how efficient he is with his time and how sharp he still is to have to make these observations and then give constructive comment to the player that isn't overly verbose and doesn't waste time, but is concise and productive. And something that I imagine can only come out of incredible experience, but also his time as a player working as a session musician on film and television scores, I think has probably tremendously helped him as a conductor.
And also, I think those musicians are also very, very, experienced and well versed enough in those kind of environment that they know when they have a good conductor they have to follow, versus maybe a not so great conductor, so that they say, let's follow the click and not the conductor.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, we'll sort of carry him on this one. Yeah.
So guys, I think that we shared such an incredible amount of in-depth discussion here, and I really want to thank you all for accepting to be part of this, and
absolutely our pleasure.
I really want to again to tell how much I appreciate the work you're doing with your own underscore podcast, which is absolutely, I recommend anyone watching or listening to this to check Will and Marty's podcast as soon as you can, because it's really really beautiful, fantastic analytical stuff. Well, you can go to the nuts and bolts of musical analysis, but always in a very clear and very transparent fashion, I'd say.
Well,
that means a lot. Thank you.
That means so much coming from you. Oh, thank you so much. I mean, that's it makes all of the hard work worth it to know that people appreciate it. And I think the reason we do it is the same reason that I imagine you do this podcast, is we feel a sense of a personal responsibility, because you look at the world. I mean, this great man and composers like John Williams, who, that sentence is almost a misnomer because there's no one quite like John Williams, but to think he's still alive and that his legacy is possibly uncertain. And so I think all of us, I imagine, feel a sense of responsibility to do our part to ensure that he stands, on the peak, on the mountain face, up with all of the other great classical composers, and do our small part.
And I would apologize for the length of our conversation, except this seems to always happen whenever lovers of film music are able to connect. We could probably talk for a few more hours. I apologize. It's so late over there where you guys are. So.
Well, no, but it's fine.
Yeah, well, it was absolutely a treat to be able to share with you and to pickle your brain about this. I'm sorry that I couldn't pick your brain, both of you, about John Williams, also the songwriter, because I know that both of you are fond of songwriting, and you tried your hand extensively into songwriting. And there's
same time next
another
week.
aspect
Let's
of John
do
Williams.
this again.
Absolutely,
because there were a lot of things I would have liked to touch upon, but we've been rambling for almost 2 hours now, and I think it's already enough if we can say so. I mean, I could go on, but maybe for the sake of our audience's patience, we will not stretch the timing too much.
Let's make it a
That sounds
promise
fair.
then to do another round in the future, so we
That
can
would be
maybe
wonderful.
pick out some other interesting aspects of John's music, but also talking about your own music, your work as composers, and that would be absolutely nice to for me to talk with all of you. So, Will, Marty, Gianmaria, thank you all for being part of this video feature of the legacy of John Williams, and hope to speak with all of you very, very soon.
Thank you, Maurizio.
All the best.
Okay.
It was our
Thanks.
pleasure.